The grand cavernous halls of the Shadow Claw Pack were steeped in a suffocating, centuries-old silence, broken only by the crackle of massive pitch torches lining the obsidian walls. It was the night of the Century Rite, a sacred, archaic gathering that occurred only once every 100 years, or when a sovereign ruler was forced by the elders to select a king. At the absolute center of the grand chamber, resting upon a raised dais of polished black glass, sat the Starforge Throne. It did not look like a seat meant for a mortal. The colossal throne had not been carved by human or shifter hands. It had been violently birthed from the cosmos, forged entirely from the jagged metallic heart of a fallen star that had struck the mountain millennia ago. The throne was a massive, intimidating structure of dark, unearthly iron. According to the most ancient, blood-sworn legends of the pack, the star metal was not dead. It was merely sleeping. The archaic texts promised that the throne would completely reject the unworthy, remaining as cold and dead as winter stone, and would only ignite with a blinding primordial Lycan fire when the true fated king took his rightful seat. For over 400 years, the Starforge had remained entirely, disappointingly dead. Sitting rigidly in a heavily carved wooden chair beside the silent meteorite was Alpha Queen Kierra. To the hundreds of elite warriors, rival lords, and ambitious suitors gathered in the flickering torchlight, she looked like an untouchable, flawless goddess of war. She wore intricate dark steel armor polished to a mirror shine, draped in a heavy cloak of crimson velvet. Her posture was razor straight, her sharp, stunning features set into an expression of cold, unyielding arrogance. Her piercing emerald eyes swept over the crowded hall, with a calculated, lethal disdain that made seasoned warlords look away. But beneath the heavy steel plate and the toxic, arrogant facade, Kierra was drowning. Since inheriting the crown after her father's brutal death in the border wars, she had carried the crushing, tectonic weight of the entire territory on her shoulders. She had bled for her people, strategized flawlessly, and fought on the front lines, yet it was never enough for the Patriarchal Council of Elders. They whispered relentlessly in the shadows, conspiring and demanding that a queen without a king was a vulnerability that invited invasion. To survive the political venom of her own court, Kierra had been forced to adapt. She had allowed the council's toxic conditioning to harden her heart, learning to mask her profound, suffocating exhaustion with cruel mockery and unapproachable arrogance. To show even a single fraction of a second of vulnerability or mercy was to invite a blade to her throat. She played the part of the heartless tyrant perfectly, because it was the only way she knew how to keep her pack from tearing itself apart. Far away from the oppressive political spotlight of the dais, standing quietly in the deep shadows near the armory archway, was a man who saw right through the queen's steel armor. Ronan stood with his back pressed against the cool stone wall, his arms crossed casually over his chest. He was a male Omega, possessing a slender, tightly corded, unarmored build that was entirely dwarfed by the massive vanguard warriors pushing past him. He had warm olive skin, dark, perpetually messy hair, and hands that were permanently stained with the deep, dark hues of sacred ink. Ronan was the pack's ink master. He was the historian who etched the runic triumphs, bloodlines, and sacred oaths directly into the flesh of the Shadowclaw warriors. He spent his days in a quiet, dimly lit chamber, mixing crushed obsidian and night-blooming hemlock to create his art. Because of his Omega biology and his gentle, observant nature, the traditionalists of the pack openly despised him. They mocked him relentlessly as a weak, useless peasant, loudly joking that an ink master only knew how to wield tiny needles while real men wielded heavy broadswords. Ronan never fought back. He simply lowered his head, absorbed the insults, and returned to his quiet work. But the entire pack was completely, devastatingly blind. Ronan was not a fragile artist. He was a walking, breathing apocalypse. Buried deep beneath his gentle, unassuming Omega camouflage, locked away behind insurmountable walls of absolute metaphysical control, was the reincarnated soul of the First Lycan King. Ronan harbored a god-tier, world-ending alpha aura that he spent every waking second of his life relentlessly suppressing. It was a suffocating, tectonic gravity that felt like a dying star trapped entirely within his ribcage. He kept it hidden because he despised the toxic, power-hungry politics of the modern Pax. He had seen the way ambition corrupted the soul, and he preferred the quiet peace of his ink and needles to the blood-soaked reality of a throne. Yet, as Ronan watched Queen Kierra from the shadows, his deep, observant eyes softened with a profound, unspoken empathy. His highly attuned aura could feel the frantic, exhausted heartbeat thrumming beneath her heavy steel breastplate. He could feel the sheer, overwhelming terror she masked with her arrogant sneers. He understood her burden perfectly, and a small, dangerous part of his suppressed soul ached to step forward and shield her from the vultures circling her throne. A heavy, echoing blast from the ceremonial war horns shattered the tense silence of the great hall, pulling Ronan from his thoughts. The Century Rite was officially commencing. The Alpha candidates, a line of the most brutal, heavily muscled warlords from across the territories, began to step forward to test their divine right upon the Starforge. One by one, the arrogant lords climbed the obsidian steps. One by one, they sat heavily upon the jagged, star-metal seat, puffing out their chests and baring their teeth for the crowd. And one by one, the ancient meteorite remained utterly, mockingly dead. Not a single spark, not a single shift in temperature. The stone rejected them all with an absolute, silent indifference. Queen Kierra watched the failures with a bored, condescending smirk carefully plastered across her face, though internally, her dread was compounding. With every failed candidate, the restless, violent energy in the hall grew more volatile. Finally, the crowd parted, and Warlord Garrick stepped forward to claim his turn. Garrick was a massive, heavily scarred brute of a man, the leader of the Pack's most elite vanguard, and the very embodiment of the Council's toxic traditionalism. He possessed a terrifying, domineering physical presence, his massive shoulders draped in the thick furs of a bear he had killed with his bare hands. He firmly believed that empathy was a disease, that omegas were nothing more than subservient property to be owned, and that might was the only acceptable metric of leadership. He did not care about the legends of the Starforge. He intended to claim the throne and Queen Kierra to solidify an absolute, unyielding dictatorship. The massive warlord confidently ascended the dais, his heavy steel-plated boots echoing like cannon fire against the black glass. He did not bow to the queen. He simply threw his heavy fur cloak over his shoulder, turned, and sat down hard upon the ancient meteorite. The great hall held its collective breath. Thousands of eyes locked onto the dark metal, waiting for the spark. Nothing happened. The Starforge remained as cold and dead as a tombstone. A low, collective murmur of disappointment and shifting tension rippled through the gathered crowd. Kierra let out a short, cold, perfectly engineered laugh that cut through the silence like a whip. "It seems the cosmos are entirely unimpressed with your brute strength, Garrick," she mocked, her voice dripping with the arrogant venom the council demanded of her. "Perhaps you are not the god you believe yourself to be." The humiliation hit Garrick with the force of a physical blow. The brutal warlord's face darkened into a mask of rabid, unhinged fury. His absolute refusal to look weak in front of his warriors violently overrode his political restraint. If the dead stone would not validate his supremacy, he would simply force the entire room to recognize it. Garrick stood up from the dead throne, his eyes flashing with a toxic, enraged crimson. He unleashed his heavy, suffocating alpha aura, projecting it outward into the hall like a physical weapon. It was a vile, domineering pressure, meant to crush the windpipes of anyone who dared question him. "The stone is an archaic relic," Garrick roared, his voice shaking the heavy banners hanging from the cavern walls. He stepped aggressively toward Queen Kierra, entirely ignoring the ceremonial protocols, his hand dropping to the hilt of his massive broadsword. "I do not need a piece of dead rock to tell me what I am. I am the strongest warrior in this territory. I claim this throne by right of blood and steel, and I will force this pack to kneel, with or without a glowing chair." The Century Rite was rapidly deteriorating into a violently hostile coup. Kierra's elite guards tensed, but the sheer, crushing weight of Garrick's projected dominance held the room in a paralyzing, toxic grip. and from the shadows of the armory archway, carrying a heavy folded ceremonial tapestry in his ink-stained hands, Ronan took a quiet, fateful step into the light. The heavy, toxic alpha aura projecting from Warlord Garrick was a vile, suffocating wave that pressed against the chests of every wolf in the Great Hall. It was a crude, unrefined dominance built entirely on intimidation and fear. The air grew thick, the torches seemed to dim, and a paralyzing, breathless silence gripped the gathered crowd. Garrick stood at the edge of the obsidian dais, his hand resting aggressively on the pommel of his massive broadsword, glaring at Queen Kierra with a barely contained, rabid violence. Kierra's own elite guards were struggling against the pressure, their hands locked on the hilts of their weapons, unable to draw them. The queen remained seated in her carved wooden chair, refusing to flinch or show an ounce of the sudden, sharp terror seizing her heart. Her face remained set in a mask of absolute, mocking disdain, but she knew the reality of the situation. Garrick was actively staging a coup. He was using the chaotic failure of the Starforge to force a physical confrontation he knew he would win. Into this suffocating, incredibly volatile theater, Ronan stepped out from the shadows of the armory archway. He was completely invisible to the political power struggle unfolding on the dais. The quiet Omega simply carried the heavy, intricately woven ceremonial tapestry, a required artifact that was supposed to be draped over the Starforge upon the conclusion of a successful claiming. He moved with a practiced, silent grace, keeping his eyes lowered to the stone floor, attempting to skirt the edge of the massive crowd to deliver the tapestry to the ceremonial attendants near the back of the hall. He was the Inkmaster, a servant of history, entirely uninterested in the rabid posturing of warlords. But Garrick, desperately searching for a target to fully assert his absolute dominance and humiliate the Queen's court, caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. The warlord's toxic crimson gaze locked onto the slender, unarmored figure carrying the tapestry. He recognized Ronan instantly. To a brutal traditionalist like Garrick, the Omega Inkmaster was the ultimate embodiment of weakness, a male who submissively painted skin instead of shedding blood. He was the perfect, defenseless prop to turn the sacred rite into a cruel, dominating spectacle. "Halt!" Garrick's voice boomed through the hall, a deafening roar that made several nearby nobles physically flinch. Ronan froze. He did not look up, but his grip on the heavy tapestry tightened slightly. Garrick didn't wait for a response. He marched down the obsidian steps with heavy, earth-shaking strides. The crowd scrambled backward in terror, parting like water to clear a path. The massive warlord crossed the floor and violently intercepted the Omega. Without a word, Garrick snatched the heavy tapestry from Ronan's arms, throwing it carelessly onto the dirty stone floor. He then reached out with a massive, gauntleted hand and gripped Ronan aggressively by the collar of his simple tunic. The physical difference between the two men was staggering. Garrick was a mountain of muscle, heavy steel, and toxic aggression. Ronan was slender, entirely unarmored, and purposefully radiating absolute submission. Garrick effortlessly dragged the quiet artist forward, hauling him back across the hall and aggressively marching him up the black glass steps of the dais. Ronan did not fight back. He allowed himself to be dragged, his dark, ink-stained hands hanging limply at his sides. He kept his massive god-tier aura locked entirely away, completely burying the apocalyptic fire within him beneath layers of practiced, submissive silence. To struggle would reveal his strength, and he was deeply committed to his camouflage. Garrick dragged Ronan to the very top of the dais, right in front of the dead Starforge Throne and the seated Alpha Queen. He violently shoved the Omega forward, sending Ronan stumbling slightly before catching his balance. "You mock my strength, Queen Kierra." Garrick projected his voice outward, ensuring every single terrified wolf in the cavernous hall heard him. He gestured mockingly toward Ronan. "You sit behind a piece of dead rock and pretend it holds divine judgment. If this archaic stone is the true measure of a king, then let us test its limits. Let us see if it favors the weak." Garrick turned to Ronan, his face contorted into a cruel, sadistic sneer. He drew his massive, heavy steel broadsword and pointed the tip directly at the Omega's chest. "Sit on the throne, Inkstainer," Garrick commanded, his voice dripping with pure malice. Rest your fragile bones on the god's seat. Let the entire pack see what a true joke this Century Rite has become. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the massive crowd. To force a low-ranking Omega, a mere servant, to sit upon the sacred Starforge was an unimaginable, unforgivable blasphemy. It was the ultimate, humiliating desecration of their most holy legend, designed entirely to prove that Garrick answered to absolutely no law or god. Ronan stood silently before the dead, jagged meteorite. He looked at the heavy steel blade pointed at his chest, and then, very slowly, he turned his head to look directly at Queen Kierra. His deep, observant eyes were completely devoid of fear. They held a quiet, incredibly intense expectation. He was giving the queen a choice. He was looking at the woman he secretly understood, silently offering her the opportunity to break her toxic conditioning, to stand up against the arrogant warlord, and to protect a member of her pack who could not defend himself. Kierra felt the devastating, piercing weight of his gaze. A sharp, incredibly painful pang of guilt violently struck her chest. Every true instinct she possessed screamed at her to draw her weapon, to leap from her chair, and to sever Garrick's head for daring to desecrate the rite and humiliate an innocent man. But the suffocating conditioning of the elders, the relentless, paralyzing fear of looking weak in front of a restless, violent army, violently crushed her true nature. The council had drilled it into her mind for years. A queen who shows mercy to the weak is a queen who invites rebellion. She was entirely surrounded by heavily armed, power-hungry men, waiting for a single excuse to tear her down. She made her choice. She chose the armor. Kierra broke eye contact with Ronan. She forced a cold, cruel smirk onto her face, leaning back in her wooden chair with an air of profound, calculated boredom. "A fitting jester for your circus, Garrick," Kierra announced, her voice perfectly steady, projecting the toxic arrogance required to survive her court. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly through the silent hall. "Go on then, peasant. Sit on the stone. Let us all witness the absolute absurdity of a weak artist playing make-believe upon a god's throne. It will provide excellent entertainment before I order my guards to throw you both out." The words hit Ronan like physical blows. He didn't flinch, but his quiet, empathetic heart broke for her. He saw exactly what she had just done. She had sacrificed her own soul, her own honor, to maintain a hollow, fearful facade. He didn't feel anger toward her mockery. He felt a profound, overwhelming disappointment. He turned away from the queen, his gaze dropping back to the dead, cold star metal of the massive throne. "Are you deaf, Omega?" Garrick roared, growing impatient with the theatrical delay. The warlord stepped forward, raising his heavy gauntlet. Without giving Ronan a chance to move on his own, Garrick slammed his massive hand into the center of Ronan's chest. It was a vicious, full-force shove intended to entirely humiliate the smaller man, designed to send the weak artist violently sprawling backward onto the jagged, unyielding stone of the ancient meteorite. Ronan was forcefully thrown backward. He lost his footing on the polished black glass, his arms flailing slightly as gravity claimed him. He fell heavily backward, and the very millisecond his slender, unarmored back made physical contact with the cold, dead star metal of the Starforge, the laws of physics, biology, and ancient prophecy violently, catastrophically collided. The universe does not negotiate with the arrogance of mortals. The very millisecond Ronan's slender, unarmored back made physical contact with the cold, jagged star metal of the massive meteorite, time in the Great Hall seemed to violently, sickeningly stop. For one agonizing fraction of a microsecond, there was absolute dead silence. The jeering laughter of the traditionalists died in their throats. The toxic, suffocating pressure of Warlord Garrick's projected dominance simply evaporated, completely erased from the atmosphere as if it had never existed. And then, the dead stone woke up. It was not a spark. It was not a slow, smoldering ignition of ancient magic. It was an apocalyptic, catastrophic detonation of pure, primordial Lycan fire. A blinding, towering pillar of radiant, golden light erupted from the very core of the Starforge Throne, shooting violently upward with the kinetic force of a volcanic eruption. The light was so intensely bright, so flawlessly pure, that it instantly washed out the orange glow of the hundreds of pitch torches lining the walls, plunging the rest of the cavernous hall into stark, terrifying contrast. The fire did not radiate physical heat, but it carried a metaphysical weight that was infinitely more devastating. High above, the ancient, magical wards carved into the high arches of the ceiling, wards that had protected the Shadow Claw Keep from invasion for 1,000 years, could not contain the sheer magnitude of the power awakening within the throne room. With a deafening, concussive crack that sounded like splitting glaciers, the ancient protective runes violently overloaded and shattered. A massive shockwave of displaced air blasted outward from the dais, blowing out every single torch in the hall and sending the heavy, ceremonial banners violently tearing from their iron mounts. At the epicenter of the golden inferno, Ronan finally, irreversibly stopped hiding. The quiet, submissive Ink Master, the man who had spent his entire life burying his god-tier biology beneath layers of absolute silence and practiced weakness, released the metaphysical chains holding his soul captive. The dying star he had kept suppressed inside his ribcage went violently supernova. His true, unadulterated alpha aura detonated outward. It did not hit the room like a wave. It slammed into the great hall like a falling mountain. It was the purest, most terrifying manifestation of apex predator gravity to ever exist on the continent. It was the primordial, world-ending dominance of the First Lycan King, an entity that demanded absolute, uncompromising biological submission from every single living creature within its devastating radius. The physical subjugation of the court was instantaneous and catastrophic. Warlord Garrick, the massive, brutal brute who had just forcefully shoved Ronan onto the throne, was standing less than 2 feet away when the aura detonated. The sheer atmospheric pressure of Ronan's true nature hit the warlord with the force of a physical battering ram. Garrick's eyes rolled back in his head as his own alpha biology was violently, utterly crushed into dust. The massive warlord was instantly thrown to his knees, his heavy steel knee pads cracking the polished black glass of the dais. He could not breathe. He could not move. The suffocating gravity of the First King smashed Garrick's face directly into the floor, pinning him like a completely paralyzed insect beneath the boot of a god. But it did not stop with Garrick. The apocalyptic shockwave rolled through the cavernous hall, taking no prisoners and offering zero mercy. The sickening, synchronized sound of thousands of heavily armored knees violently slamming into the stone floor echoed over the roar of the golden fire. The elite vanguard guards, the visiting warlords, the arrogant alpha candidates, and the corrupt, whispering council elders were all instantly ripped from their feet. Their inner wolves whimpered in absolute, unhinged terror, throwing their mortal bodies to the ground in complete, involuntary surrender. And sitting rigidly in her carved wooden chair on the dais, Queen Kierra was hit by the tidal wave of divine gravity. The heavy steel plate armor she wore, the armor she used to distance herself from her people, suddenly felt like it weighed 10,000 pounds. The air was forcefully driven from her lungs in a sharp, pained gasp. Kierra tried to fight it. She tried to ignite her own fierce sovereign dominance, to hold her head high against the suffocating pressure, but her biology instantly betrayed her. The toxic, heavily engineered arrogance she had used to mock the Omega entirely evaporated. Kierra was forcefully dragged from her chair. She collapsed onto her hands and knees on the black glass of the dais, her heavy crimson cloak pooling around her trembling frame. As her bare hands touched the trembling glass, the roaring golden fire of the Starforge shifted. The ignition of the ancient meteorite had not just awakened the king, it had triggered a deeply dormant, profoundly ancient architecture buried within their souls. The sacred mate bond snapped into place with the world-shattering force of a falling star. It was a violent metaphysical collision. Kierra gasped, her spine arching as the golden light from the throne surged directly into her chest. The connection was instantaneous, terrifying, and overwhelmingly intimate. Through the blazing tether of the bond, all of Ronan's suppressed truth flooded into her mind. She felt the heavy, ancient, endless centuries of his reincarnated soul. She felt the absolute, unyielding peace of a man who possessed enough power to end the world, but chose to paint flowers on skin instead. And simultaneously she felt his profound, echoing disappointment in her. The realization hit Kierra with a devastating, paralyzing clarity. The quiet, gentle artist she had just publicly mocked, the defenseless servant she had abandoned to the cruelty of Warlord Garrick to save her own toxic pride, was not a peasant. He was her fated mate. He was the First Lycan King. He was the most terrifying god-tier apex predator in the known universe, and she had laughed at him. Tears of profound, overwhelming awe and deeply shattering shame spilled from her emerald eyes, cutting through the dust on her pale cheeks. She was physically pinned to the floor, her heart racing with a primal, terrified reverence, completely unable to look away from the golden inferno. Within the blinding pillar of Lycan fire, Ronan slowly stood up from the Starforge Throne. He was no longer the hunched, submissive ink master. As he rose, his slender frame seemed to command the very architecture of the massive cavern. The golden fire swirled around him, completely harmless to his flesh, but actively burning away the simple, ink-stained tunic he wore, revealing the heavily corded, glowing runic scars that marked his true ancient heritage. His stormy, observant eyes had ignited into a blinding, luminescent gold. He radiated an unparalleled, majestic dominance that did not need to shout, threaten, or wield a broadsword to be absolute. Ronan stepped down from the ancient meteorite. The dead star metal behind him continued to burn with a ferocious, eternal light, completely validating his divine right to rule. He stood at the center of the dais, looking down at the hundreds of heavily armored warriors and arrogant lords who were currently pressing their faces against the dirt, in absolute, terrified silence. The Century Rite was over. The era of the corrupt, toxic council and their arrogant warlords was permanently, violently finished. The Starforge had finally ignited, and the First Lycan King had returned to reclaim a pack that had entirely forgotten what true, unyielding strength looked like. The cavernous great hall of the Shadow Claw pack, once a deafening theater of arrogant posturing and toxic political whispers, was now submerged in a terrifying, suffocating silence. The blinding pillar of golden Lycan fire, radiating from the Starforge Throne, cast long dramatic shadows across the thousands of paralyzed bodies pressed firmly against the stone floor. No one moved. No one dared to breathe loud enough to draw the attention of the god-tier apex predator, standing at the center of the obsidian dais. Ronan stood tall, the golden fire reflecting in his ancient luminescent eyes. He possessed no heavy steel armor, no thick furs, and no broadsword, yet he radiated a crushing, absolute sovereignty that made the heavy plate armor of the vanguard look like pathetic, hollow tin. At his feet, Warlord Garrick was drowning in a rabid, cornered panic. The massive brute, whose face was still smashed against the black glass by the sheer weight of Ronan's aura, felt his mind violently short-circuiting. The reality of the universe had just inverted itself. The weak, useless Omega he had dragged up the stairs was the First Lycan King. The humiliation of being forced to his knees by a man he had just mocked was a toxic acid burning through his frantic brain. Driven by an unhinged, suicidal desperation to reclaim his shattered pride, Garrick let out a ragged, strangled roar. Fighting against the suffocating, god-tier gravity, with every ounce of his massive strength, the warlord managed to push himself up onto one knee. His trembling, gauntleted hand blindly grasped for the hilt of his massive broadsword, completely intending to drive the heavy steel blade into the back of Ronan's legs. "Die, peasant!" Garrick shrieked, hauling the heavy weapon upward in a desperate, frantic arc. Ronan did not even turn around. He didn't flinch. He didn't drop into a defensive stance. The true Lycan King simply stopped suppressing a fraction of a percent of his apex kinetic potential. Without looking at the warlord, Ronan casually raised a single, calloused, ink-stained hand and snapped his fingers. The sound was not loud, but the metaphysical impact was catastrophic. A concentrated, localized shockwave of pure kinetic force slammed into Warlord Garrick like an invisible meteor. The heavy steel broadsword did not just break. It violently, explosively shattered into 1,000 pieces of useless gray dust, completely evaporating mid-swing. The concussive force continued through the destroyed weapon and slammed directly into Garrick's chest. The heavy steel breastplate caved completely inward with a sickening crunch. The massive warlord was violently thrown backward, his boots entirely leaving the dais as he flew through the air. He crashed heavily into the base of a massive stone pillar 30 feet away, instantly knocked unconscious. His arrogant pride and his physical strength permanently, effortlessly annihilated without Ronan ever having to look at him. The immediate, terrifying display of effortless, bare-handed lethality permanently extinguished any lingering thoughts of rebellion in the hall. The corrupt council elders, seeing their championed warlord dismantled like a fragile toy, began to weep into the dirt, entirely terrified of the judgment about to fall upon them. Ronan lowered his hand. The suffocating, crushing pressure of his aura slowly, deliberately receded, shifting from a weapon of absolute domination back into a warm, deeply resonant golden wave. It was no longer meant to paralyze. It was meant to anchor. He slowly turned around, his luminescent golden eyes locking onto Queen Kierra. Kierra was still on her hands and knees, her heavy crimson cloak draped over her trembling frame. The terrifying, soul-shattering realization of the mate bond was still burning brightly in her chest. She had spent her entire reign building walls of toxic arrogance and cold steel to protect herself from men like Garrick, only to publicly humiliate the one man in the universe powerful enough to actually save her. She waited, completely paralyzed by shame, for the ancient king to strike her down. She expected him to strip her of her crown, to mock her as she had mocked him, and to cast her into the dirt where she belonged for failing to recognize true power. But Ronan did not raise a hand in anger. The god-tier king stepped slowly across the black glass of the dais. He stopped right in front of the trembling, humbled queen. He looked down at the heavy steel armor she wore, the physical manifestation of her fear and her toxic conditioning, and his eyes softened with a profound, unbroken empathy. He did not see a cruel tyrant. He saw an exhausted, terrified woman who had been forced to wear a mask of iron to survive a court of vultures. Ronan slowly dropped to one knee, lowering himself until he was perfectly eye-level with his fated mate. "You do not need the armor anymore, Kierra," Ronan whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated with absolute, unconditional devotion. He reached out, his bare, ink-stained hand extending toward her. It was not a command to submit. It was an offer of absolute equality from a god. Kierra's breath caught in her throat. The heavy, paralyzing shame in her chest was instantly washed away by the brilliant, warm light of his golden aura. She looked at his calloused hand, realizing with a profound, earth-shattering clarity that the First Lycan King did not want a submissive servant. He wanted a partner. With a trembling hand, Kierra reached out and placed her palm in his. The moment their skin touched, the golden fire of the Starforge flared brightly, bathing them both in a halo of radiant, sovereign warmth. Ronan's grip was firm and incredibly safe. He stood up, gently but firmly pulling the queen to her feet, elevating her from the floor to stand exactly at his side. He did not let go of her hand. Ronan turned, facing the thousands of kneeling wolves in the great hall. "The Starforge has spoken," Ronan's voice boomed, completely devoid of the quiet submission of the Ink Master, echoing with the absolute, unyielding authority of the First King. "The era of your whispers, your toxic traditions, and your arrogant warlords is permanently dead. I claim this throne, and I claim Queen Kierra as my fated mate and equal sovereign. If any wolf in this territory ever questions her authority again, they will answer to the fire that sleeps in my blood." The corrupt council elders remained completely silent, their power permanently broken by the undeniable truth of the glowing meteorite behind them. Warlord Garrick was a broken heap against a pillar. The Shadow Claw pack had just been violently dragged out of the Dark Ages. Queen Kierra squeezed Ronan's hand, her emerald eyes shining with fierce, unshakable clarity. For the first time in her life, she did not have to mask her exhaustion with arrogance. She was perfectly, completely safe, anchored by a gentle artist who possessed enough power to break the world, but had chosen to hold her instead. But what do you think? Did Queen Kierra get off too easily for mocking him, or did she redeem herself by finally accepting his hand? How would you react if the quietest, lowest-ranking servant in your pack was shoved onto an ancient throne, only to trigger a world-ending explosion of golden Lycan fire. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this epic tale of dark fantasy romance, hidden identities, and a deeply satisfying role reversal where the toxic traditionalists get completely dismantled, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow shifter romance fans. And if you want to hear more stories where true power couples tear down the archaic, toxic traditions of their packs to protect the ones they love, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next epic tale.